They say your home is your sanctuary. It's the one place where you can lock the doors, leave the anxieties of the world outside, and finally breathe. We are conditioned to believe that ghosts, demons, or dark entities only haunt abandoned asylums, desolate highways, or graveyards. But what if the real terror isn't out there in the dark? What if it's breeding right inside your bedroom, directly under your mattress? What happens when the door you lock to keep the world out is actually trapping you inside with something unimaginable? Today's story is based on entirely true events. We have changed the names of the people involved to protect their identities. This is Ria's story, and fair warning, this isn't just a ghost story. This is a story about human hatred and how sometimes the resentment of the living is far more dangerous than any dark magic. Ria was a modern, independent woman whose life was going perfectly. She was in a long-term relationship with her college sweetheart Aman, and they had finally decided to get married. But in Indian society, a marriage is rarely just about two people. It is the collision of two entirely different families and foundations. The problem was that Ria and Aman came from completely different social backgrounds. Aman's family was deeply orthodox and traditional. His parents believed that their family's honor and social standing were above absolutely everything else. They strictly adhered to ancient rituals, superstitions, and rigid religious practices. Initially, Aman's parents flat out rejected the relationship. For months, there was heavy emotional manipulation, family drama, and bitter arguments. Even Aman's older sister refused to accept Ria. But Aman stood his ground. Eventually, when he threatened to cut ties and leave the house for good, his family reluctantly caved in. The wedding, as most of Indian weddings, was grand. Ria was ecstatic, thinking that love had won, and that with time, her new in-laws would forget the bitterness and accept her. But she didn't realize that some families never actually concede defeat. They just change their tactics. After the wedding, Ria moved into Aman's family home. It was a massive, traditional two-story estate, but it carried a suffocating atmosphere. The air inside always felt incredibly heavy. Despite having large windows, the house always seemed to swallow the sunlight, leaving the rooms draped in shadows. The air constantly reeked of strong incense and burning resin. On the surface, Aman's parents treated Ria well. They smiled and called her their daughter. But Ria could always feel a bizarre, freezing undercurrent to those smiles. It was a gaze full of pure malice, looking at her not as a human being, but as an unwanted pest. Ria and Aman's bedroom was on the ground floor. It was a massive room, dominated by a towering, antique wooden mirror that used to belong to Aman's grandmother. The carvings on the frame were so grotesque and imposing that just looking at it made Ria deeply uncomfortable. Just 2 weeks into the marriage, Ria was alone in the house cleaning their bedroom. She opened the top drawer of the wardrobe, which was usually kept locked, and found some old files. As she moved them, a photograph slipped out and fluttered to the floor. Ria picked it up, and blood in her veins ran cold. It was a physical copy of a photo from their engagement ceremony. Aman's face was untouched, but right in the center of Ria's forehead, someone had smeared a thick, pitch-black mark, like soot or ash from a cremation ground. Worse still, on the white border beneath the photo, something was scrawled in red ink. It wasn't English or Hindi. It was some strange, archaic script, violently scratched into the paper. A wave of pure, sickening negative energy washed over her. She immediately grabbed the photo and marched straight to her mother-in-law's room. With a trembling voice and a racing heart, she placed the photo on the table. "Mom, what is this?" Her mother-in-law barely blinked. There was no shock, no panic, and absolutely no guilt. She calmly adjusted her glasses, offered a cold, calculated smile, and said, "Oh, sweetheart, why are you panicking? I had this done for your own good. A family astrologer looked at your birth charts and said this marriage would attract the evil eye, maybe even a heavy curse on you. So I took this photo to a spiritual healer to create a protective charm. Just put it back, it's keeping you safe." Her voice was so disturbingly calm and rational that for a second, Ria second-guessed herself. In many cultures, protective amulets and warding off the evil eye are completely normal. Ria forced herself to accept the logic, put the photo away, and didn't mention it to Aman. She didn't want to spark a massive fight so early in their marriage. But that was just the beginning of a much darker conspiracy. Ria tried to push the photo out of her mind, but our subconscious rarely forgets a threat. The atmosphere in the bedroom grew increasingly oppressive. Ria started suffering from constant, heavy migraines. She also noticed that the healthy indoor plants she had placed on her nightstand were suddenly withering away without any explanation, the leaves turning black and rotting. About 10 days later, on a Sunday morning, Ria was changing the bed sheets. The mattress was heavy, so she lifted the corner with both hands to tuck the fabric in. As she did, she noticed something resting on the wooden slats beneath, right under the exact spot where she rested her head every night. She lifted the mattress higher. Sitting there was a small pouch made of black cloth, tightly bound with thick red and black threads. Her hands began to shake. She picked it up. It felt practically weightless. The threads were tied in a complex, chaotic knot pattern. As she pried the fabric open, a terrified gasp escaped her lips. She dropped it onto the floor. Spilling out of the black cloth was a handful of coarse white ash. Buried in the ash was an old, heavily rusted iron nail, and coiled tightly around that nail were long strands of black hair. Ria didn't need to be an expert to know what this was. This was no protective charm. Anyone could see this was a hex bag, a vessel for dark, malicious occult magic. And the most horrifying part was that it had been deliberately placed right beneath her head. That night, when Aman got home, Ria showed him the pouch, crying and begging him to take it seriously. But Aman's reaction shattered her. He looked at the pouch, got visibly annoyed, and brushed it off. "Ria, stop obsessing over this superstitious stuff. My mom is old school. She probably put it there for good luck. Don't make a scene out of nothing. I already have enough stress at work." Aman was fearlessly defensive of his parents. That night, Ria realized she was entirely alone in that massive house. She tried to stay quiet, hoping it was just a harmless, old-world superstition. But she was wrong. When you sleep just inches above concentrated negative energy for 8 hours a night, it doesn't just affect your body, it begins to hollow out your mind and your soul. Things began to happen that defied all logic. Sometimes she would wake up in the dead of night with the overwhelming feeling that someone else was in the room. She would hear the sharp, raspy intake of freezing breath right next to her ear, but when she turned, there was only Aman. She started developing dark, sunken circles under her eyes. She was losing weight rapidly and sinking into a profound, suffocating depression. She genuinely thought she was losing her mind. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a freezing night in late November, around 3 a.m. The house was dead silent. Suddenly, Ria's eyes snapped open. She felt what seemed like ice-cold, decaying fingers lightly brush against her toes. The room was pitch black, illuminated only by a faint amber glow bleeding through the window from a street lamp outside. Ria tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't obey. She was completely paralyzed. She couldn't even twitch her fingers. Her breathing grew shallow. And then a foul stench flooded the room. It smelled like stagnant water and rotting meat in a damp, enclosed space. Unable to move her head, Ria darted her eyes towards the darkest corner of the room, near the door. Standing there was a figure. But it wasn't human. It was a towering, impossibly dark silhouette, a shadow that seemed denser and blacker than the darkness surrounding it. It was slowly sliding along the wall. It wasn't walking. It had no legs. It was gliding across the floor like a thick, heavy smoke. As it drifted closer to the faint amber light from the window, Ria saw its face. It didn't have normal eyes. Instead, staring back at her were two small, smoldering red embers. There were no pupils, just points of burning crimson light fixated entirely on her. Ria wanted to scream. She wanted to violently shake Aman awake. But all that escaped her throat was a breathless, silent sob. Tears streamed down her face as her heart hammered against her ribs. The shadow drifted right up to the edge of her bed, looming directly over her face. She could physically feel the freezing, putrid air radiating off it. It stared down at her for what felt like an eternity. Then the shadow turned. It glided slowly toward the massive antique mirror resting across the room. Ria watched in absolute horror as the shadow reached the glass and, like a heavy stone sinking into a dark lake, stepped into the solid mirror. The glass rippled like water, and then nothing. The very second it vanished, the temperature in the room normalized, the rotting smell dissipated, and the paralysis broke. Ria shot up in bed, gasping for air, and lunged for the bedside lamp. The sudden light woke Aman up. He panicked, asking her what was wrong, as she pointed a shaking finger at the mirror, sobbing hysterically. She didn't explain it to him. She knew he would just dismiss it as a bad nightmare. But Ria deep down knew the truth. What she saw wasn't a dream. It was a physical reality. The next morning, Ria packed a bag. She knew if she stayed another night, she would entirely lose her sanity, or even her life. At the breakfast table, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor, she calmly announced that her mother was ill and she needed to go stay with her for a few days. Her mother-in-law took a slow sip of her tea and looked at Ria with a piercing, unnerving gaze. The same cold smile crept onto her lips. She didn't say a word, she just slowly nodded her head. By the afternoon, Ria was back in her childhood home. The moment she was inside those safe walls, she broke down entirely. She told her mother everything: the defaced photo, the hex bag of ash and hair, and the red-eyed shadow in the mirror. Her mother was terrified. She immediately knew this wasn't a psychological breakdown. That evening, she took Ria to a highly respected spiritual healer, a priest who specialized in identifying dark occult practices and negative entities. Ria told him everything and showed him a picture she had snapped of the defaced engagement photo on her phone. As soon as the priest saw the strange script written beneath her face, beads of sweat formed on his forehead. He closed his eyes, whispered a long prayer, and let out a heavy sigh. He looked at Ria with a mix of pity and absolute terror. "My child," he said softly, "your mother-in-law lied to you. That wasn't a protective charm. The ash, the hair, the rusted nail, they weren't meant to kill you. They belong to an ancient, deeply forbidden branch of dark magic, a magic used for replacement." Ria's voice trembled. "Replacement? What do you mean? Why wouldn't they just kill me?" The priest shook his head. "If they killed you or chased you away, they knew Aman would leave them forever. They didn't want to lose their son. They just wanted you to become so physically and mentally broken that your spirit simply gave up. They needed your body to become an empty vessel so that the entity they bound to that antique mirror, that shadow you saw, could cross over and possess you entirely. They didn't want you as a daughter-in-law. They wanted it, and it was slowly hollowing you to make room." Ria went completely numb. A high-pitched ringing echoed in her ears. The priest immediately performed a cleansing ritual and tied a consecrated red thread around her wrist. He warned that as long as she wore the thread and stayed far away from that house, the entity couldn't touch her. Ria never went back to her in-laws' house. Aman called relentlessly. They fought bitterly. Ria tried to explain, even offering to let Aman speak to the priest. But just as she expected, he accused her of being delusional, superstitious, and insulting his family. The relationship fell apart, and they are currently going through a divorce. Ria still lives with her parents. She hasn't taken the red thread off her wrist for a single second, and she is slowly trying to rebuild her life. But the story doesn't end. There is a large mirror in Ria's childhood bedroom. She never looks into it at night anymore, and she always drapes a heavy cloth over it before she goes to sleep. She sleeps with the lights on, because sometimes, right before she sleeps, she can still feel it. The entity is no longer trapped in her in-laws' house. It has latched onto her. It watches her from the other side of the glass, waiting patiently in the dark, waiting for the day that the red thread finally falls off, so it can finish what it started.